Okay, welcome back to the Shared Practices podcast. This is episode 6 of the pre-ownership flashback. And we have a pretty cool guest today. I'm flattered by these professionals that are listening to our show. So how did you get to know Brian, George?
Well, Brian is a frequent contributor on our Facebook group. And, I've always thought that he's had great things to share. And I've actually heard good things about people who've worked with him. So I thought it'd be good to reach out to him. And, I think, just like Wayne before, kind of in the middle of season 3, I'd gotten a lot of requests from people who, would have a great things to share on our show. But it just kind of couldn't really do it during season 3. So I just saved them up. And now I'm using some of those, some of these spots that we have available to interview some of these great guests.
Well, and the cool thing about Brian, so it's Brian Hanks, and
he's a buyer's rep, correct?
Yeah, buyer's rep. So like a lot of times people on our show are like, well, who should I go to help me? Like, even though we've given them a lot of tools, they still want someone representing them. They still want someone kind of guiding them through the process, being like their quarterback. And a lot of times, you get into this dual representation kind of stuff. So it's nice to have someone who's just only does the buyer side of things, both to get his perspective and as a name that if people like him on the show, they should reach out to him and work with him.
Yeah, and I think, before we listen to this episode, you're going to hear a lot of things that we've already talked about. And I like that because when we started season 2, nobody talked about acquisitions at all. And if you've listened to the entire season 2 and now you're listening to the pre-ownership flashback, you're going to feel like this is very repetitive. And to me, that tells me that I think we really did our job because, nobody was talking about this before. And now, Brian brings a lot of great information and a lot of it is stuff that, we've already heard. So I think it's great to kind of get a holistic review on a lot of, very important things that buyers need to keep in mind.
And I loved some of his stories. So you guys will hear some specific stories and some specific perspectives. But you and him just kind of brought everything together. So I thought it was more than just kind of a rehash. It's for me, it's just every time you kind of like think about this process, you add another layer of knowledge and experience and filters to it. So that's what this episode did for me, for sure.
Well, good. Let's go ahead and jump right in with Brian Hanks. I have with me here today Brian Hanks. And for those of you who are on our Facebook group, you probably see Brian commenting a lot. He's one of those guys that really, really knowledgeable about buying practices in general and listens to our podcast. I always like to have people who listen to our podcast on the show because I think they understand what we're about. And so I'm excited to have him on today. How's it going today, Brian?
George, it's great. I'm excited to be on. Like you said, I'm a fan. And so I'm excited to be here. Thanks for the invite.
And so, Brian, I'd like to hear, a little bit about your background for everyone listening. And then also, a lot of professionals like yourself happen to listen to our show. And I guess from our perspective, I always wondered what you guys really get out of it, because you're kind of experts in the field. So I think it's just a bit different. So I'm also curious to see, what you like about dental podcasts in general.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I'll answer your second question first, and then I'll give you my background. But what I get out of the podcast, contacts. I reach out to folks I hear that do a great job and compliment them and just say, hey, thank you. I learned, XYZ tidbit that I didn't know before. And then B, I am always learning. A student, there's no way I can know everything about A, the dental space, or B, transitions in general. I try to, but there are constantly new things coming up, aspects of dental leases or startups that I'm not familiar with. I'm learning from. So just like your listeners, I'm learning and learning who to talk with.
That's cool.
But so nice job. And you guys have done a great job pulling together some of the best resources out there. In fact, I work a lot with several of the names that have been guests on the podcast. And I know good from bad, and you guys have the good ones on. And so your listeners are well served by listening to the podcast.
Well, I appreciate it. And I know that today's episode will be no different. And Brian, so why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and what got you into what you do?
Sure. Yeah, it's when I tell people what I do, I always get kind of the quizzical, Dwayne Johnson eyebrow raise. Like, how did you get into that? And it's fairly roundabout, but I took a typical path into banking and investment management. I went to Brigham Young University for undergrad. I worked for a few years in banking, and then went and got my MBA at the University of Michigan. And my father-in-law he retired last year, but was a general dentist in the Seattle area. And he introduced me to a dental CPA firm in Dallas, a large one that I went to work for. And I worked for them for a time, focused primarily on dentists just buying dental practices. Went to work for another dental CPA firm for a few years as well. And while I was at the second dental CPA firm, I just authored a lot of blog posts on buying dental practices, frankly, doing a poorer job of what you guys have done on the podcast. But looked at that and cobbled together after a series of 20, 30 blog posts. I looked and said, hey, I think I have enough for a book here. And I authored a book, got some traction with that. I had enough folks reach out that now this is all I do. I still have a few financial planning, investment management clients that I've kept, but 95% of my time I spend just helping buyers of dental practices.
So for somebody who is a typical client of yours, where do you typically start working with them? And then how long and how far along do you work with them? And how does that whole engagement work with what you do?
Yeah, great question. I take a dentist who has found a practice that would like to know if it's a good one. So typically, my typical client comes to me with a practice in mind. And my engagement's in 3 steps and ends the day that they close on the practice. So I just work with the buyers through that transition period. And when you walk through the doors of your practice with keys in hand, I shake hands, wish you luck, and follow up with you. But that's the end of my engagement. Then those steps in between, just in broad terms, they fall into 3 buckets. The first bucket being analysis. So it's, okay, George, you found a practice. Is it a good one? A. B is the price fair? So looking at evaluation. And then C, if you pay that much, and given how much you have in student loans, how much are you going to make? How much money is going to be coming in? And so that's bucket 1. Bucket 2 tends to be negotiations. So I'll help the buyer create a letter of intent and negotiate with seller and or broker, as the case may be, and then help them find financing and help them navigate those banking waters. And step 3 or bucket 3 is just helping consult them through all it feels like thousands of steps you have to take as a new business owner to get ready to run that practice. Business entities, IRS filings, bank accounts, credentialing, insurance, all of that I help those dentists with. So that's working with me in a nutshell.
That's pretty cool. And, when we were talking about what to talk about on the show, I think you had prepared some common mistakes that you see buyers make in those buckets and as long they go through the process of buying their practice.
I have, and I have 7 of them, George, if that's not too many. We can go through them rather quickly, but yeah, you're not going to be surprised by what they are. And I tried to rank them in order of maybe importance or impact, but I have 7 common mistakes I see buyers make. And so I hope the listeners of the podcast find these valuable. But far and away, George, number 1 mistake I see is just not being clear about your career goals and how an acquisition or a startup may fit into those career goals.
Can you elaborate on that?
Example,
oh, perfect.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Classic example is, in fact, you probably can go find some posts on the shared practices page, but go to a Facebook group, a dental Facebook group, and find the post that says, hey, I'm looking at this practice. Here are a few statistics. Is this good? And of course, the answer is, well, I don't know who are you and what do you want to accomplish? And do you like Medicaid patients or do you want to do fee for service and where do you want to live? And so I know, and I can appreciate, my career has been roundabout as well. And it's impossible in dental school, for example, or even a year or 2 out as an associate to know everything you want in your career. But it's absolutely essential just to know a few things at a minimum: geography, how busy you want to be, the type of patients you want to work with. And if, for example, if you hate certain procedures, if you can be as clear as possible about your career goals, it'll help you immensely in finding the right practice for you.
I think that I couldn't agree more with that. And recently in season 3, we had Jamie Amos on who talked about vision in terms of a startup. And I was kind of talking to him in the episode about, I think vision has a lot to do with acquisitions too, because like you just had mentioned, I think not every practice is for every person, and it's about finding the right practice for you as a dentist, where you're going to be for the rest of your career.
Right. I think a lot of buyers feel pressure. They feel like, if I don't buy the right practice, man, I'm in this thing for the rest of my career. And that's not totally true. It is expensive to reverse course or to buy a practice and then decide you don't really want to be a boss. You'd rather just go work in corporate. So yeah, you can get some bonus points if you know you want to be solo or you'd rather work with a partner, or if your goal is to own multiple practices and sell to a private equity, how you want to market the practice. I mean, there are things that listeners of this podcast, for example, will have a sense for and will help them. But yeah, you're right on, George. The clearer you can be about your goals, the easier it will be to navigate the dental acquisition or startup waters.
And so now, mistake number 2.
Mistake number 2 is impatience. And I'm trying to think if I've heard anybody directly talk about this. I'm sure some of the folks on your podcast have, but I think in dentistry there is an assembly line mentality, right? It's a pretty defined path you're on to become a dentist. And it starts in kindergarten, right? All the way through high school, college, undergrad, get good grades, get your DATs, get into dental school, decide, associateship, GPR, whatever. And so it's a relatively defined path that you're on. And so when dentists are ready to buy, they're ready to buy now. They're not looking to wait 6, 9, 12 months for the right opportunity. And I don't blame them. They've been on a pretty defined path, but a lot of times, for what reasons oftentimes outside of the buyer's control, there aren't opportunities available, or the right opportunity just hasn't come available yet, or is close to coming up soon. And so the number 2 mistake I see buyers make is just impatience. They force it. They buy a smaller practice than they really want to, thinking they can grow it. Or the classic, George, would be, I can't find anything, so I'm just going to go start a practice. Not that there's anything wrong with a startup. Startups are a great option. But if your goal is to buy an established practice, throwing your hands in the air and saying, well, I'm going to go spend $500,000 and spend the next 3 years of my life trying to build up a patient base, seems to me a kind of a foolish way to go about it. So yeah, number 2 is impatience.
I'm so happy you got the startup. You made the startup comment, not because, I think everybody on the podcast knows that I'm biased and whatnot, but I just get that like every week. I get somebody saying like, I've looked for a practice. There's nothing available in my market, so I'm going to do a startup. And yep. I always tell them like, okay, well, you're going to take about 6 to 9 months probably to just get a lease signed anyway for your lease for your startup. Right. Why not spend the next 6 to 9 months looking to buy a practice at the same time?
Or doing what some of the folks on your podcast have done, mailers, getting really creative with dental society leads and lists and things. I mean, there are a lot of ways to find a dental practice, and which actually is a really good lead into mistake number 3, George, if you don't mind me going there already.
I just want to wrap up that topic.
Sure.
I think that impatience, I think we do a bad job on the show of, I think we kind of lead maybe to that impatience, talking about practice ownership and getting people fired up. So I do feel like in a way we don't advocate that enough. But I think leading into number 3, I'm assuming you're going to talk about it, but you just doing everything you can to find as many opportunities as possible. That can really kind of be your way of being impatient, have that urgency to go get all those opportunities. All right, I'll let you go.
No, slight tangent though, but if you're going to err on the side of caution or firing people up, I would much rather you fire people up, because there are a lot of voices out in the dental community that are telling young dentists that buying a practice is an impossible dream now, that student loan balances are too high, DSOs are buying them all up, and you just can't do it. And so I'd rather you fire people up. So my 2 cents.
Well, that's good. So what's mistake number 3?
Number 3 is just a poor personal network. Or another way to phrase this would be just relying on brokers too much. Brokers are great. They fill a great role. But I haven't seen reliable statistics. But George, you got to think it's probably at least half of dental practices don't get publicly listed or listed with a broker somewhere. And so the number 3 mistake, I think, is related to number 2. And that's just not having a solid network of opportunities or folks feeding you opportunities in either locations for a startup or acquisition targets. So a quick story. This last winter, I got a call from 2 buyers in the same week. Both of them happened to be in Denver. And They're both general dentists. They're both like one was 2 years out of school. The other was 2 3/4 years out of school. So kind of very similar profiles. And dentist A got on the phone. They weren't looking in the exact same market. I think one was in Aurora, the other one was Centennial, but it was close. And dentist A gets on the phone and says, Brian, I finally found a practice. It's taken me forever, but there is just nothing on the market. Will you help me analyze this one practice? Dentist B gets on the phone and says, Brian, I've got 6 practices that have come up in the last couple of months. I'm trying to decide between them, and I got a call this morning about a 7th. I need your help. And these were the same market, same basic and as I got talking with these guys, the difference between them was really, it came down to their personal network. And it's having lunch with dentists. It's sending the Facebook messages, buying coffees, going to the study clubs, showing up at the dental shows. That personal network or lack of is what can make or break finding a good opportunity if you're in the acquisition or startup game.
Yeah, and I think, I'm really happy you talked about the profile of these dentists. Can you quickly, so 2 things I want you to talk about. One,
sure.
I think people underestimate how important their profile as a buyer is to their success. Yeah. And then 2, I want you to talk about, so if somebody's only relying on brokers, by the time a broker sends them a practice, if they're just some average dentist who's talking to them, how many other people do you think have looked at that practice?
Yeah, oh man, it's impossible to say, and every situation is going to be different. But I would say on the average, at least 2 or 3 serious potential buyers have looked at the opportunity and passed. And that's on the average, and you're going to have exceptions to that rule. But by the time a broker sees the practice, the selling doctor, who, by the way, may have a poor personal network as well, so it works both ways, but that selling doctor has engaged a broker because they're relying on the expertise, and they're relying on that broker to help market the practice. And brokers have a lot of strong relationships with many times with buyers, but oftentimes with bankers, attorneys, DSOs, middle market investment bankers that are looking at different opportunities for, conglomerates and things. So the broker's incentive, by and large, is to sell that practice quickly. And if they know they can sell a practice to someone besides, going out and posting it on Craigslist or their homepage or somewhere, they're going to do that. Does that help?
Yeah, and I think I think the other thing that I wanted to add is when you're talking to a broker, that broker is always, whether they're doing it, they're kind of judging you and, assessing you and almost grading you as a buyer. How easy are you going to be to work with? How responsive are you? How easily are you going to be able to get financing? Are you diverse clinically or not? Those types of things will also impact, are you buyer 2 to look at the practice, or are you buyer 6? You know what I mean?
Can I add a few things to that list that
Please.
Brokers tell me? So financial picture, which is mistake number 5. We'll get to that in a little more detail. How do you look financially? Production history. How long have you been out of school? And then, what's interesting as I talk with brokers, and we have pretty frank conversations, both before and after deals close, it's interesting how big a deal personality makes. Are you friendly? Are you respectful? Do you treat the broker like, the valet? Or, I don't know, somebody that you don't treat very kindly. I try to treat my valets nice, but, it makes a big deal. The broker is evaluating whether or not to put you in front of their client. And they're not going to stick everybody in front of their client. And so, I couldn't agree with you more.
And so I'm just curious, how do brokers, so you are a buyer's representative, and so how do brokers, view you and interact with you? Just curious, kind of a tangent.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think the initial reaction is met, oh gosh, somebody that's going to negotiate against me. You just had Brian Hammond from Car Realty on.
Brian Madden.
Sorry, Brian, if you're listening, but by and large, the brokers love having me on the deals because I can speed the process along. I do a lot of the education with the buyers, a lot of the hand holding that they don't need to do anymore. So it's just having another professional on the other side of the deal. They tend to love it. There are brokers out there who don't like me very much. And that's a source of pride because there are bad actors out there that I help protect buyers from. But by and large, I have great relationships with brokers around the country.
More of that after the break, but first, a word from our sponsor. Okay, now that you've realized that your neck hurts not because of the weight of your loops or the angle of declination, that it hurts because you're looking over your telescopes, the next part that should frustrate you about your current pair of loops is that there's this wasted space between the bottom of the frame and where it's comfortable to look down. So I want you to look down when you're wearing your loops. So look below the loops, below the frame. And if you look down really far, like as far as you can without moving your head, eventually that's strain, that's uncomfortable. You can't have the loops that far down. You can't hold that for a while. There's this whole zone of comfortable space between the bottom of the frames and where the loops could be placed that's wasted because of your current frame. Q Optics has designed not only a new frame, but also a way of measuring the space of your face. They actually take like a face bow of you and take a picture of it and put it in the computer. There's this little contraption with green dots that you wear on a pair of glasses, and they take a photo from the front and a photo from the side. And they've got some fancy names for it, but essentially they're doing a map of your face, a 3D map of your face, and maximizing the amount of frame that can dip down and they can put loops in. Why wouldn't you maximize that for every single person? Well, it's easy. It's easier to just buy a bunch of preset frames than it is to make custom frames for everybody. So if you're interested in maximizing the real estate that you have available, you can send an email to sales@qoptics.com with the promo code SP16 for $100 off a pair of loops or $300 off of a loop and light combo. It's time for you to stop wasting all that space.
And I think the added thing is, I think there's this lack of perspective that happens a lot in deals where people get so emotional and they're like, well, the seller's trying to do this to me, and it's nice to have a professional on there to say, this is just regular behavior and it's not a big deal, and, life will go on. And so I think, having a buyer and a seller's representative just seems natural, where you have two different people doing that to two different parties.
Couldn't agree more. And, mistake number 4, if I can skip ahead a little bit, is I called this one assuming rationality, which is another way to say what you just said, which is, often in a deal, in fact, maybe in every deal I've seen, at some point, the buyer or somebody is going to say, why would they do, fill in the blank? Someone's going to be confused by some step in the process and not understand why either a step is necessary or someone is digging in their heels on a deal point, or why a lawyer needs to be involved in some aspect of the deal. And assuming that all of the players are going to act rationally and that no emotions are going to be involved is a total fool's errand. But for some reason, I would say the majority of buyers that I work with assume that, the seller's just going to, this is like treating a crown, these are the steps and we do it and you get up and you leave and that's it. And that's not this is the seller's life work in most cases. They've built this practice, they've shepherded it along, and they're excited to find the person that's going to take care of their patients and clients and our patients and staff. So can I give you a couple funny examples of maybe some irrational behavior?
I think our podcast could be a little bit more funny. So yeah, go for it.
I just finished closing a deal up in Bellingham, Washington. Buyer and seller were negotiating price. Buyer and seller landed on $1.3 million as the purchase price, and we had to waste a couple days in the negotiation because the seller. It finally came out that the seller wanted the price to be 1.3 and $1 because the number 13 is unlucky, and wasn't. No big deal. It's $1. No, fine. We didn't have a problem with it, but it was funny that he was reluctant to say that out loud, and it took us a couple days to figure out what was going on. And that was that's just kind of a silly example. Another one that was actually very impactful was a seller and buyer trying to decide on the close date, and the seller wouldn't close in a specific window of time because Mercury was in retrograde. And if you pause and think about it, I had to think about what that, I was like, Mercury, like thinking it was a company. No, it was the planet Mercury. It was, and hey, look, I go to church. People can laugh at me, and I'm not laughing at that particular belief, but it's not a thing that you can read in a book. No, there's no resource or podcast out there that's going to tell you that the seller isn't going to close in this month because of something that you can't foresee. So I just caution a lot of buyers to remember that there are a lot of emotions. This is a big purchase for you. It's a big sale for them. People, up and down the line, brokers, bankers are getting paid, and you're messing with people's addiction to food, clothing, and shelter. So assuming rationality can be a mistake.
Great. That's awesome. Those are, pretty odd stories, but I'm sure you see stuff like that. In my deal, a couple of things came up that were like a little weird, but you just kind of go with it. I think as a buyer, you have to roll with the punches a bit and really kind of respect the seller and give them their space.
Totally.
When they do this.
Yep.
So what's the next common mistake?
Mistake number 5 is, as a buyer, not having your financial house in order. And there's probably a better way to phrase that, or maybe just not understanding how to present yourself best financially as a buyer or a startup guy. I don't mean to discriminate between the two, but especially as a buyer, and I would bet that the majority of your folks are going to do acquisitions. There is a preferred buyer profile in terms of financing, both for the broker and the banks. And a lot of buyers get in trouble because of a few very common things. First is not having enough cash. Usually, and dentists are successful, they're smart, and as a rule, very savvy folks. Usually it's because they've been paying down student loans. They've been aggressively paying down those student loans, and so they don't have any cash in the bank. And you've had some lenders on that have talked about why the rationale behind that, but not having anywhere from 5 to 10% of the purchase price, or $50,000 tends to be kind of a magic number for banks. But not having enough cash can kill you. The other one that I see very commonly is not enough production history. So you do $40,000, $50,000 a month where you're at, and you're trying to buy a practice that collects $1.5 million a year, and the bank's going, well, George, that's great, but how do we know you can produce $90,000, $100,000 a year? Other things do come up. Having large student loan balances, is not typically something you're going to have in your control by the time you're looking at an acquisition, but that can be a big one. So if you're an undergrad thinking about dental school and you're listening to this, please consider how much school costs. I know you can get loans no matter where you go, but how much that student loan balance is by the time you're done can significantly impact your choices of where you buy and what you buy when you get to that point. And then, just please don't miss a credit payment. That Kohl's card you got for the 10% off the new shirt, whatever, and you miss the payment for 60 days. I'm helping a buyer right now who's perfect in every other way, and just one little mistake has hit that credit score, and it's really going to affect the rate she's going to pay. So, just not having your financial house in order and forgetting some of the basics can be a big deal.
Yeah, and I think from our perspective, we're very unattractive on paper, my wife and I, as buyers, and I think that was something that understanding that and having answers to those questions was important. Yep. But I think for the majority of people listening, they are pretty attractive, and they just need to know what banks are looking for. And I think the big one is student loans, like you had mentioned. Keeping that liquidity, because a $50,000 difference in your student loan balance is not significant compared to having $50,000 cash in the bank.
Huge. Yep. No, dentistry is I've got the CFP, Certified Financial Planner credit designation behind my name. And so money topics are especially important to me. And dentistry it's such a great, lucrative career choice. It's a great choice. There's probably a slogan on the wall of the ADA somewhere that says dentistry, the best career in the world. But I feel like there should be an asterisk next to that slogan. It's hey, it's the greatest career in the world if you can wait 5 to 10 years longer than your friends to start your career and buy a house and do all those things. And if you can handle the psychological pressure of hundreds of thousands in student loans, and if you can be disciplined to save, $50,000 or whatever the number is to buy a practice, not that you have to buy a practice, you have to do a startup to have a great career in dentistry. But if that's your goal, there's some discipline that's involved financially, and you can screw up and you can do it right. And so you might as well know how to do it right.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And, on a totally off topic, I think also, just the being a dentist in general is challenging. So, I throw that in there as well, but I agree. Yep. I think it's, it has the ability to be a really great career choice for a lot of people, but it also has its, downsides.
Totally. All right. Mistake number 6, George, is negotiating too hard. I'm going to go on a soapbox for a second, but I'll get right back off.
Please do.
Leave some money on the table. I'll say it again. I'll say it slower. As a buyer, or if you're negotiating a lease in a startup, anything where there's real big money involved, leave some money on the table. Do not try to get the maximum benefit from the deal, leaving as little as possible for the other side. I can't tell you how frustrating this can be for me. And I understand the mentality. I do. You want to wring every penny out of the deal for yourself because it could be the biggest purchase you ever make in your life. And I'm not saying that you should be a sucker and that you should overpay, but just please don't be the kind of person who is always looking for not just an edge, but the maximum edge every time. You're going to get a reputation. Brokers won't send you the best deals. Bankers won't want to give you the best offers. And a lot of times, you're going to read some story on Facebook about how somebody negotiated the heck out of some deal somewhere. And that person that got that amazing deal is going to neglect to tell you the 4 other deals that they killed because they were possibly better because they just killed all of the goodwill with the seller. So that topic of goodwill, that's a technical accounting term, but it's also a real term in the sense of, that reputation and what that seller is going to say about you when they're in line at the grocery store with that hygienist who's thinking about coming to work for you, or talking at to their study club buddies who are 10 years younger than them that might refer you business. That goodwill is worth so much more than the extra $10,000 that you negotiated off the purchase price, or 80% goodwill instead of 85% on the asset allocation. And to be fair, George, brokers sometimes need this lecture from me. So it happens on both sides. But if you're the buyer, negotiating too hard can be a big mistake. I
mean, how many times do you think we've said that on this show? I mean, I can't emphasize that enough. I think that's such a great point, and it's definitely worth mentioning again because, I mean, as you said, people get emotional, and like the sellers you just talked about got emotional about weird things. Yeah. I think this is probably the thing that buyers get the most emotional. Like, well, the practice isn't worth whatever, But honestly, I always say I would much rather pay a high price for a great practice than pay a low price under market value for a bad practice. And So if it's the right practice, then do whatever it takes to get it, because those don't come around very often.
Yeah, you do say it a lot, and every time you do, I kind of clap internally. So keep saying it.
Will do.
That's great advice.
And I'm happy that it's not just us. I learned that from Hunter Smith, and it just seems like everybody is kind of adopting that mentality in our little world here. And I just think it's good that people have that sense of perspective. So I appreciate you mentioning that one. That one's like one of my favorite ones. Good. Yeah, no problem. Last mistake I see is a little self-serving, so I stuck it at the last. It's maybe the least impactful, but it's just, I would kind of in general qualify this or categorize this as not paying for help. There's a significant do-it-yourself crowd out there. You can find a lot of great information. This podcast is example number 1 of places to go get quality, helpful advice. And, as a dental student, you've been living in an 800 square foot apartment, eating top ramen, and you're reluctant to go out and pay somebody like me or a lawyer. I think that paying for good help on a decision of this import on a purchase price that's probably, depending on what size of house you buy, could be the biggest purchase you ever make. I think paying for good advice is worth every penny. And
again, the silly example of the mentality maybe to avoid is, and in the Dental Town forum or the Facebook group where you see the person say, hey, does anybody have a sample dental practice purchase agreement that they can share? And I usually withstand the temptation, but sometimes I just want to reach out and say, what are you going to do with that? Are you literally going to buy a dental practice with somebody else's legal documents and just do a find and replace on the names? Like, holy cow, like, oh my goodness, I don't want to get my implant done in your clinic. But anyway, it's a big purchase. Get the right kind of help. Don't overpay. Be smart about it. Do your research, but get some good qualified help.
And I think the point I'll make to that is I used a lawyer. I used the buyer's representative. I used, I had all the professionals on my team that we recommend everybody have. And, I've looked at how many 100 practices for sale and, done all that homework, and I still felt the need to get professionals. So I think no matter how much you definitely need professionals. Where I think I think we cater to the DIY crowd. With the Ownership Accelerator and everything we do, we really give them a lot of resources. And where I think you can thrive if you're a DIY person is doing the homework and maybe looking at 20 practices and then narrowing it down to like the best ones based on your knowledge, and then sending it to professional. As opposed to, don't send every practice over. There might be a bunch of garbage there that you're going to be paying somebody to look at. But at the same time, don't buy a practice without having somebody look at it. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. You can get a lot of the way yourself, but there's enough technical aspects that I agree. Somebody to look at the real estate, accountant, lawyer would be the minimum in my mind. But depending on the situation, there may be other folks that would be helpful to get involved.
Couldn't agree more. And why don't you go ahead and talk about your book a little bit?
Oh yeah. So if you go up, for listeners of the podcast, because I'm such a fan, I wanted to make an offer to the listeners of the podcast. If they're interested, I have 2 books available on Amazon. They're, because I'm an accountant and maybe lack a little creativity, they're both titled How to Buy a Dental Practice, volumes 1 and 2. And if you could pop on Amazon, you're welcome to buy them. But if you're listening to the podcast, I'd like to offer those 2 books free of charge to listeners of the podcast if they're willing to just cover the shipping, which I think is, maybe $5, $6, $7 or something like that. And if they're interested in taking me up on that offer, they can go out to my webpage, brianhanks.com/shared practices. And Brian is with an I, so BRIAN, hanks.com/shared podcasts, or shared practices. And I didn't get those there.
Yeah, and we'll have that link in the show notes as well. For any of you who are listening that want his book, then he'll do that. You can just go to the webpage. I'll put that in the show notes for you. So we've talked a lot about what's required to take that great step forward into your first practice. There are so many elements to consider in this process that it's easy to downplay the importance of one absolutely critical component, location. Or as the marketing gurus say, location, location, location. Many of our colleagues limit themselves and their potential success by simply trusting a realtor to find an appropriate space. Realtors have a wide wealth of knowledge and local knowledge, but even a commercial specialist is unlikely to know or understand the unique criteria that can make or break a dental practice. However, our sponsor, Design Ergonomics, is familiar with these criteria because they've been designing, equipping, and training the nation's most productive offices for the last 20 years. Dental Ergonomics offers a Clarity site selection service that covers an astounding number of individual data points, over 100. These include population demographics, traffic patterns, visibility, municipal regulations, the competitive landscape, and more. Running these points through an analysis algorithm, they provide a simple, categorized report and an overall ranking, making it much easier to compare locations. This can be an invaluable tool to narrow down your targets. If you've pinpointed a few potential sites on your own or through a realtor, but as a busy dentist, we often don't have time to do the initial search in the first place. And if you're looking in an area 30 or 40 miles away, you may not know exactly where to start. The logistics of that might be challenging and will be very time consuming. Regardless, Design Ergonomics has a solution here as well, a second level of site selection called Focus. With the Focus site selection, the research will do the legwork for you. Through remote and on-site investigation, they'll generate profiles for up to 5 top-notch locations that'll work with your vision and goals. This allows you to make an informed decision just on the right spot to build the practice of your dreams. For more information on site selection and other dental ergonomic services, go to www.desergo.com. Enter promo code shared location on the contact page to receive a $300 off discount of Clarity or Focus site selection services for a limited time. Again, that's www.desergo.com. Enter the promo code shared location on the contact page to receive a discount off of the Clarity or Focus site selection services. And
thanks, George.
I had one more question I want to talk to you about. You have any more stories, learning experiences from the buyer side that you think you wish you could share right now?
Yeah. Themes start to emerge as you work with, dozens and dozens and hundreds of buyers over the years. And, you've heard a lot of the themes as I've kind of gone through common mistakes, but just to maybe drive home a few of the points, I'll share a story about a dentist who was a specialist, a pediatric dentist looking at several practices in the geography where he thought he wanted to be. And as he kind of went through the process, his wife started feeling like, I don't know that I want to be. And they were looking in upstate New York. It happened to be January when they're having this discussion. So you can imagine like the drifts of snow going through that they're driving through as they're talking about this. He starts to say, my family's in Arizona. Do we really want to be here? And this is as he's looking at practices to buy. And as it turned out, he had several good options, but he turned them down and started his search all over from square one in a new location. And the way that he did it was to build a network in the area. He didn't reach out to any brokers initially. He reached out to other dentists and reached out to folks he knew, and then started to reach out to secondary contacts and tertiary contacts, and just started to build a network of folks in a space of about a month. I mean, and we're not talking several months here. I had a lot of phone conversations and got the lay of the land where good practices might be. He did hire a demographics consultant to kind of help him know where, better areas to be and where he might want to land. But at that stage, he went from, hey, I'm about to buy a practice in Buffalo, New York, to I have found, and 6 weeks after we had this conversation, he had 4 practices, all grossing over 1.5 million, which is maybe less impressive as a pedo office than in general, but still very impressive in general. But 4 pedo offices grossing a lot and all for sale, and all in a market that I think a lot of people would consider very saturated. And he did it by knowing what he wanted, knowing where he wanted to be, looking like a good buyer, being willing to, and he was upfront when he was talking with people, hey, I'm not going to nickel and dime a seller. If you know of somebody, I'm willing to pay full asking price or, whatever's fair. And he had a set of advisors. He had his team already set to go. And, 4 weeks later, he had an assigned letter of intent and was packing up his house to move to Arizona. So, we joke about this, the failures, the silly, Saturn isn't in the right place in the sky. Those types of stories are entertaining. But to me, I get inspired by the success stories. And this actually happened to be a close friend of mine who I lived with for a number of years, and I helped through the transition. And he just did it right. And he knew what to do, and he executed it. And he is having the time of his life in the practice of his dreams. And I think that, if you're listening to this and that's something that you want, you can have it as well.
I love that. And can I add a layer of understanding to that I kind of took away from that story? You brushed on it, but the buyer, he talked to other people and he said that he's willing to pay full price, and he probably seemed like a reasonable person. He probably resonated with all the people he's talking to. And I think the one thing that I don't do a good enough job, and I'm trying to emphasize more, is the importance of appearing to be the right buyer. I think a seller will bend over backwards for you if they're convinced that you are the right person for their practice and they want to do a deal with you, as opposed to, feeling like you're replaceable. I think they'll be less willing to work with you. So that's something that I think is another thing that we didn't talk about that I think is very important is just being very personable with the seller and taking whatever concerns they have, because they're going to have concerns, and showing them that you are the person that will alleviate their concerns and make them feel better about this and help them through the whole process.
Yeah, well said. Brett, better said than I did. And by the way, 3 of the 4 that he ended up looking at were off market. These were sellers that were intending to list their practices in 12 to 18 months, but because this guy came along, they were inspired. He was the right buyer. They felt that he was a great fit, and they were willing to sell to him. So, yep, couldn't agree more, George.
And I the only reason I know that is because I talked to a few dentists on Dentaltown. I kind of messaged them, reached out to them early in dental school, and I asked them, about their process of selling their practice. And a common theme I heard from a few of them is it's like they felt like they found the right buyer, and so they sold a little early or a little later than they wanted to for that buyer. And so that was always my goal, was to be presentable as the right buyer and have things go my way as a result. And so I encourage everybody here to really take that and try to be viewed as the right buyer in the eyes of the seller.
Well, just to put a plug in that and maybe a stamp on the end of the episode, there are very few resources out there that I recommend to everybody I talk with, and I recommend every buyer listen to your podcast. So, folks, you're listening to a good resource. Maybe not this episode, but all the other episodes are really good. And I can't thank you enough for the opportunity to be here, George.
No, it was awesome. And I think our audience definitely got a lot out of this one. I think it's great to kind of summate the things that we talk about in the show and some things we haven't talked about yet. So you definitely brought a lot to the table, and we really appreciated you coming on, Brian.
My pleasure.
All right. And just to wrap things up, we're going to have his link in the show notes for his book. And once again, thanks, Brian, for coming on.
Thank you, George.
Okay, that was another awesome interview. And there were some specific kind of funny stories, but then there were some other specific stories that drove home a pet topic of mine, which is the personal network. So was there anything, before I go into this, is there anything that stood out to you, George?
No, you're so excited about the pet topic that I just got to let you go for it.
I'm like literally bottling it in right now. I love networking, like but in the most sincere way possible, not in the like, here's my business card, like awkward. So, and to the point where we were walking around the neighborhood on Sunday. We've just moved to Oklahoma. We want to build a fence because we want to have chickens in the backyard. And our one neighbor has called the city on the other neighbors to like turn them in for having chickens and letting them loose into their flower bed. Anyways, so I need to build a fence kick. And fences are kind of expensive. They're like $5,000 to $10,000, depending on what kind of fence you buy. And so we're walking through the neighborhood, and I see a home. I was like, that is the kind of fence I want. It's cedar. I like the way it's built. I like the like accent on the top of it. It's like looks clean. I love the color. I'm gonna go knock on their door and ask them if they built the fence or if it was already there when they moved in. My wife's like rolling her eyes at me, like uncomfortable that I'm just going to go knock on these random people's door and just talk with them and ask them a few questions. And so sure enough, I just walk up there with my daughters and knock on their door, and the guy answers the door and cracks it open a little bit, and the dogs are trying to get out. And I was like, hey, I love your fence. Did you guys build it yourself, or, what's the story? And he's like, oh no, it was the previous people, but we just power washed it and restained it and all this stuff. And he kind of gave me some tips. And, but that's a long tangent to say that, having the ability to build a personal network and getting out of your comfort zone, talking to people, calling people, asking them if they have anyone that you should talk with, that is a skill that is a little bit uncomfortable for some people. And so if that is something that you need to work on, that will leverage your practice search significantly. And I loved his story of his friend that had a practice fall through, and very quickly, within a period of 4 to 6 weeks, built an entirely new personal network in another state, and then had multiple practices that were on the table for him. And he also shared the example of 2 buyers in the same market, and one of them like only had one practice to look at, and the other one had like 6 or 7 to look at. And it all comes down to that personal network, your ability to just call and have a conversation and talk with people and be natural and normal and make some friends, and then ask those friends if they know of anyone else or any other, people that you should talk with, and just go from there. That kind of grunt work there is no like guide, there is no like checklist for that. That's just kind of something that you kind of have to organically do yourself and then take it wherever it takes you. So that's just something I'm so excited that he like put a label to it and like had multiple examples of how important that is. So anyways, that's I was just so excited during that episode to hear those points.
I gotta say, Richard, the story with the fence, I think you got to pick a better one to try to relay that point.
Okay, then I knocked on another door because they had chickens in the backyard, and so then I asked them about their chickens.
I mean, I was expecting something more than just like, oh no, we just power washed the fence. You know what I mean?
Well, and then the chickens people like, anyways.
Okay, but back on topic though.
The willingness to do it, even if sometimes when you call people and ask about practices, they're going to say, oh no, we just power washed it. You know, like, oh, you know, I'm not really going to sell this practice, or like, oh no, yeah, I'm not going to get it. Like, there's going to be a lot of those where nothing comes of it. And I think that in and of itself is like a nugget that you just have to be willing to just reach out to people, knowing that you're going to reach out and talk with 40 people, and 38 of those people are not going to have a practice or a direct contact for someone who does have a practice. But the last two are going to have two practices, and then you're going to have two choices that are good and off market that you wouldn't have had otherwise.
No, and I think that's a great point. It reminds me of Ike Erling. We've had him on the show before, and you know, he, in his whole process of finding off market deals, he found more than 50. And I mean, that's just insane. You know, the number of opportunities he had, and he was in Phoenix, where there are tons of buyers who, you know, I've talked to probably 4 or 5 buyers in Phoenix in my time on the show that have complained to me about the lack of inventory. And, you know, I mean, Ike is not complaining about a lack of inventory, you know what I mean? Because of the fact that he's able to generate all these deals. And so I think that's, you know, kind of to Brian's point right there.
No, absolutely. What was they? Oh, Brady Frank also did the same thing. He reached out to a bunch of dentists as he was finishing dental school, and from that had like a ton of offers of practices to buy. So it works if you can do it in a way that's sincere and non-confrontational and just leaves that door open, and then you just keep going.
So now let me turn the tables on you a little bit. How are you going to take that information and apply it to your situation?
I need to get working. I've got 3 years to find a practice somewhere between Indianapolis and Louisville. We're shooting for South Indiana, and my plan is all the brokers, all the specialists, because I think if you're looking for a GP office, reaching out to the specialists is a great way for them to like, oh yeah, no, I know such and such down the road. You know, maybe he's looking to get out. So I've got a list, and I even want to do some of it. Maybe via Facebook Live, like if I call like a broker, I'd have to, you'd have to like tell them ahead of time for them to be willing to do that. Anyways, I want to share this journey. So as I'm doing that, I will definitely update you all either on the show, intro, outro, or via Facebook.
Well, that's awesome. And yeah, I think, you know, having the information is one thing, but applying it and using it towards something is another thing. And it seems like, you know, that's a really good idea. Really great plan.
No, you got to hold my feet to the fire, which is what you're doing. I like it, George.
Awesome. Anything you want to say before we wrap up, Richard?
No, this was great. And I love these pre-ownership flashbacks. It gets to the core of like what makes us excited. And I love that I can now carry the torch now that you're going to be our ownership guy, and I'm going to be the pre-ownership guy. I'm excited to go on that journey with our listeners, because I feel like I've been away and unable to participate, and now, okay, it's on. Let's find some practices.
Yeah, it's funny for anybody who was wondering. Richard now has all the energy, and I'm the one that's dragging my feet a little bit. I'll put it that way.
It's past midnight. We're recording these intros and outros, and that was not my time schedule. That was George's, and I have to be at work at 6:30, and so I usually wake up around 4. So less than 4 hours of sleep, but I am still excited about this podcast. So
wow,
we're in it to win it.
Sorry, Richard.
It's okay. It's totally worth it.
All right, guys. Well, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week on the Shared Practices podcast.